talk a little bit about how my boat is set up for cruising, in particular here on the Chesapeake Bay. So in this episode, I'd like to start off with kind of covering the topside, the cockpit. Then in the next episode, we'll get into below deck here and the cabin and all of those kind of little things. And then in our third episode on this, we'll talk about the navigation, electronics, engine, fuel tanks, water tanks, all of those other little things. Now I'm sure as I go through this, I'm probably going to miss something. There's a lot here to cover that it's pretty basic stuff really, but I just kind of want to show you what I'm doing and how it's worked out for me so far over the past several years. So to start with, let's talk a little bit about the boat itself. And I've mentioned this several times, but there's some new listeners. Thanks guys, and continued listeners. It's a 1975 Islander, 30 foot. I've got a 5-foot draft, fin keel, and about a 49-foot air draft. It's got a 2-cylinder Yanmar. I think it's a 16 horsepower. We'll get into all of those as we go through the other steps. But let's start at the bow of the boat. And of course at the bow of the boat, there's a bow roller. And then I also have a roller furler for my Genoa / jib. Now my anchor is a Fortress anchor, and I've got 10 feet of chain on that. I'd like to go and I'd like to get it up to 30 feet, put a 30-foot piece in there, and then the 10-foot piece, I'll put that on my spare anchor, which you'll see a little bit later in the video, hung on the stern of the boat. And I know a lot of you guys are saying, well, you know, it's a Fortress it's a Fortress anchor. It's got, you know, the 2 flukes, and I've used Fortress over 20 some years. Never had a problem with it. From Norfolk, I haven't been south yet, but all the way from Norfolk up to the Thousand Islands on the St. Lawrence River, the Hudson River, Erie Canal, never had a problem. It's really super good for the bay here because the bay is, and I've said sandy, but you know, there's some sand, there's some mud, there's some gravel type bases, but for the most part it's sandy and muddy. Some rocky areas, never had a problem with it. And you'll see Fortress on a lot of various sized boats. Now the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add an access port to the anchor locker here where the white coiled line is. Just makes it easier to feed that back down the chain pipe. I also added a freshwater fill port to the deck. There wasn't one when I bought the boat. I would have to run the hose down through the cabin and into the V berth to fill the water tank, and it was pretty easy to put this freshwater port in. And then I have a little camera mount here. Got the boat set up with 2 Lifelines, double lines. Got 150% Genoa. And then here you see my whisking pole. I don't use that very often. I've kind of had to jerry rig that. I found it next to the dumpster, and I've kind of had to. But it works. I mean, that's all that counts. It works, okay. And then here's a solar vent for the head. And I added a speaker to the boat a few years ago because it tied into my VHF where I could have it as a horn, as a speaker. But the really thing that I really like about it is that it has an auto foghorn. So like you're at anchor or you're cruising, You just set this, you don't worry about it. It automatically does the right codes for it, and we'll get into that later. But I did also add just a push button horn to the boat. The little can ones that you push, I mean, they're great, they work, but it's just one more thing that gets in the way and gets rusty, and I don't know. Anyway, and I have a wind vane on the top of the mast. I don't have wind instruments, but the wind vane has worked out really well. I also run all the lines aft, including the reef line. Now I got a couple of fending poles, 2 flat fenders. I use the flat ones rather than the round just because they take up less space and they still protect the boat very well. And I've got the hard dodger with handrails. And yeah, I'm still working on the plan to upgrade and make that hard dodger a little bit better. Oh, I also added midship cleats, and that's really important in docking. Helps a lot with that. Well, let's go back to the cockpit. Another addition I put in was an engine access port or door, hatchway. There's very little room to work on the engine from the inside, so I put this port in, made it much easier to do everything with. And like when I had to change the fuel injectors, we probably would have had to pull the engine to do that had I not put this access port in. But then also up on deck here in the cockpit, I've got the propane locker. And here's that emergency anchor that I have in the stern, so I can just throw that out from back here. We've got 400 watts of solar panels, and you know, they also add shade. The arch, I mean, that's got a lot of additional uses. So I got several clamps here that I use. I've got a partial hard cover, which is attached to the radar or to the solar arch, and then there's some storage underneath for my fishing gear or my fishing poles, and then I also have some shade covers under there. Now you got to be careful when you do this if you're using this for something else. The solar panels need airflow, so don't overpack that area. I've still got a couple of inches between the shade covers when I store them and the solar panels, so that the solar panels have good airflow to them. And, you know, and I set these shade curtains up, you know, at anchor, and I just use the clips to clip them into place. It's nothing difficult or permanent. Then I have my fuel jerry can, and I use a shake hose to fill the tank rather than try to pour it. I got my flares, and on the other side I also have a freshwater jerry can. Got dinghy davits, and they fold in so that if you're at the pier and you're not using your dinghy, you can just fold them in, takes up less space. I also added a shore water hookup, make it easier when we're at a marina. We have almost unlimited, well, it is unlimited water at that point. Then of course I've got my compass, my chart plotter. Now I mainly use the tablet for my chart plotter anymore, but this chart plotter is hooked up to my VHF, so I have, it displays AIS and it's also my depth zone. So that's kind of my basic setup on the top side, and it's worked out really well for me. You know, running all the lines aft helps a lot. The solar panels with the shade, of course solar panels in general help because of the autopilot. It DC powered, and that draws a lot, so by having the solar panels it keeps charged up. I don't need to start the engine to do things, to charge, to keep the batteries charged. And we'll get into the batteries here too when we get into the part where we're talking about the engines and all of that kind of stuff. So stay tuned. We got more stuff coming up, and I hope you find these informative, helpful. And until next time, guys, happy and safe boating to you, your family, and friends. Cheers.